The British War Cemetery at Sojma near Budapest is quite small, and yet it's unusual in a couple of ways. Firstly, there are no soldiers buried there. All but one of the graves is of flight crews from the Second World War. Secondly, not all of them are British. Many are Polish, and one is actually French. In fact, he was the only French serviceman known to have died in Hungary during World War II. And it's his story that we're going to look at today. Marcel was the son of Augustin and Aurélie Tillemont and was born on the 6th of April 1920 in Paris. Shortly afterwards, the family moved to Denain in northern France, his father's hometown, and then in the late 1920s they moved to Lancel, near to the Belgian border. The textile company that Marcel's father worked for had a subsidiary in the English town of Bingley in Yorkshire. So, in 1937, along with two young colleagues, Marcel left to work there. His father, however, stayed behind and ultimately became the head of the factory. Just before his 20th birthday, Marcel passed his compulsory medical exam at the French consulate in Liverpool, and on the 9th of October 1940 he joined the RAF Reserve at Padgate. In March of 1941 he started air gunnery training at various bases throughout the country, and in November 1942 he was posted to Shandur, Egypt. His squadron left for India, but Marcel stayed behind, serving in both Egypt and Palestine up until February 1944, when he joined 148 Squadron. By the 1st of March 1944, he was transferred to Brindisi in Italy and promoted to temporary warrant officer on the 1st of May. On the night of July 3rd, 1944, although trained as an air gunner, he was also an experienced dispatcher, so was assigned as an extra crew member to help drop supplies to Tito's Partisans fighting against the Germans in Yugoslavia. The crew didn't have much experience in these kinds of drops, and there was a lot of equipment that needed to be cleared in a short time. Marcel already had done over 20 similar missions by then, so his skills were very much needed. Indeed, he'd successfully completed a drop with a different crew on the night of the 1st and 2nd of July. As with many others from Brindisi, this was no regular flight. By the autumn of 1943, following the liberation of southern Italy, British and American squadrons took over Italian airfields abandoned by the Germans, which brought Poland, Yugoslavia, Greece and Hungary more easily within reach. The RAF set up special task units to help partisans and underground movements and to deliver secret agents. On this occasion, however, virtually nothing turned out as planned. On the evening of the 3rd of July 1944, at around 2011, a Handley Page Halifax bomber from 148 Squadron, JP-286, codenamed S-Sugar, took off from RAF Brindisi. This is probably the only photo which exists of that plane. Their first task was a supply drop of armaments and supplies, plus clothing and chocolate, to French Gora, the base of a Yugoslavia mission codenamed Savannah, headed by a British officer named Basil Davidson. Davidson was born in Bristol in 1914, and in 1939 he was recruited by British intelligence and sent to Hungary under the cover of establishing a news service. In 1941 he managed to escape to Belgrade, but in May was captured by the Italians. He was later released under prisoner exchange. In August 1943 he parachuted into Bosnia and started to liaise with Tito's Partisans. He operated for a time in the Hungarian-held region of Bochka and eventually crossed the Danube to French Gora. When the Germans encircled the area in July 1944, he was evacuated on a flight taking partisan casualties to Italy. He finished the war as a lieutenant colonel, became a famous author, and died aged 95 in 2010. However, his departure meant that Savannah had collapsed, and there was no one left to return the security signal. Also, the drop zone wasn't lit. Therefore, neither JP-286 nor a previous aircraft 30 minutes before could drop their loads, leaving Marcel with little to do. It also meant that the crew retained a large weight of live ammunition and other supplies on the aircraft, probably affecting its handling. The second part of JP-286's mission was known as Deerhurst, a blind drop of 4 agents into Hungary north of Lake Balaton. The objective was to contact former Hungarian army officers who were believed to be organising a resistance group. The mission seemed ill-conceived from the start, since both SOE headquarters in Egypt and Basel-Davidson had severe doubts about the existence of established reliable resistance groups in Hungary. The population was considered too pro-German and had not experienced any of the real horrors of war by this time. There were some known pockets of resistance against the Nazis, though. Albert Szent-gyorgy, the Nobel Prize winner and discoverer of vitamin C, tried to contact the British authorities in Istanbul at the request of Miklos Kálay, the Hungarian Prime Minister. He escaped after Adolf Hitler personally issued his death warrant. The plan was, in fact, the amalgamation of 2 missions. The original Deerhurst, planned by 31-year-old Major Richard Moncrief Wright, and Sandy, planned by Lieutenant Colonel Edward Fletcher Bowie. Colonel Bowie was a senior officer with SOE in London. He had little field experience and no personal experience of Hungary, but did possess a deep knowledge of SOE operations in general and Yugoslavia and Poland in particular. This made him both an asset and a liability, since, if he was captured, he might be forced to reveal top-secret information about SOE. The risk was somewhat minimized, however, by giving him an alias and false papers, and he flew under the name Sergeant John Connor, a soldier of the Scots Regiment, the Black Watch. Ultimately, this cover would save his life. In addition to Bowie and Wright, the team of 4 included Lieutenant Francis Alexander Vosch, called Vincent, a Canadian SOE agent who was born in Kumla, Hungary on the 26th of October 1912. The family had settled in Welland, Ontario, and he joined the Royal Canadian Army Medical Corps in 1943. While serving in Italy, he answered the call for volunteers for operations in Hungary. Being fluent in English and Hungarian, he was the group's interpreter. His loyalty and his expertise were considered by his superiors to be exceptional during his training period, part of which took place at the famous Camp X in Canada. Vosch was only on the team, though, because István Máté, the planned interpreter, also born in Hungary, but known under his alias of Stephen Maitland, was killed in a plane crash near Newquay in Cornwall on the 17th of April. This event has remained one of the unsolved mysteries of World War II. The plane, an RAF Warwick transport converted for passenger use, was carrying a number of high-ranking officers and senior Free French liaison, including an aide to General de Gaulle. Some SOE operatives like Maitland were also aboard. The Warwick was also rumoured to be carrying a large amount of banknotes and even gold bullion. What we do know is that the Canadian pilot, Art Gavel, personally took charge of a couple of top-secret mailbags which he kept close to him in the cockpit. A few moments after takeoff from RAF St Morgan, the plane exploded in mid-air and everyone on board was killed. When the pilot's body was recovered some days later, there was evidence of injury from an explosion. In spite of many inquiries, the source of the device and the purpose for downing the aircraft has never been explained. Some pointed the finger at SOE and an objective to assassinate the French passengers, since de Gaulle was not really trusted by the British at this time. But would SOE have sacrificed their own operatives for this? Probably we'll never know. The team's radio operator was Corporal Anthony Manley, born in Brazil in 1916. As was normal, the flight crew never came into contact with the SOE operatives on these missions, since they boarded the aircraft last and stayed at the rear. This was the second time that Deerhurst had been attempted. According to the log of Arthur Lee, JP-286's radio operator, a similar drop had been abandoned 2 nights previously. The flight time from the failed mission in Yugoslavia to the designated DZ in Hungary was about 60 minutes. The 4 agents were supposed to land at a point northwest of Lake Balaton. Instead, after an unsuccessful flyby, they eventually jumped some kilometers away from the planned location and unfortunately landed in the middle of a forest right by a Jewish labour camp near the Head End porcelain factory. It was almost as if they were expected, and the entire group was captured in the following days by Hungarian troops and the security services. This was, of course, a time when there was suspicion of a mole within SOE, although most of the leaks had concerned French resistance activities in the Prosper Group. The SOE team split into 2, a pair on each side of the hill where they'd landed. Lieutenant Colonel Bowie later recalled what happened. Our parachutes were caught in the trees. I was hanging 30 feet up on the straps with little chance to hide. At dawn, the Hungarian army, led by the Civil Guard, was already searching for us. Nevertheless, Vincent and I managed to evade capture for almost 24 hours. Several times the soldiers searching the forest passed by only a few feet away. During one of the sweeps, one of the soldiers passed right over our hiding place. We were lucky that he didn't shoot us out of fright. They were finally captured and taken to a temporary headquarters set up in the forest. The other 2 team members were already there. They were stripped and their equipment was searched before they were interrogated. They were then driven by truck to the nearby city of Veszprém and informed that they would all be shot the next day. Instead, though, they were transported to the headquarters of the secret police on Andrássy Boulevard in Budapest, where they were interrogated for several days. They were then informed that the Arrow-Cross government, which had recently come to power, would hand them over for further interrogation at Gestapo headquarters in Buda. So, not long after, they were transferred across the Danube to the infamous Főutca prison. Throughout August and most of September, they were all questioned by the Gestapo. In October, as the Russians got ever closer to Budapest, they were transported by train, together with several Jews, to the notorious Elisabethstrasse prison in Vienna. Here they were separated, and it seemed that they were going to be executed along with many prisoners of other nationalities and legal statuses, a daily occurrence in the prison. After a few days, though, they were back on a train together again, with no idea where they were going. They only knew that they were heading west. Eventually, they arrived in Oberursel, near Frankfurt, the Luftwaffe's main interrogation centre. The interrogations weren't very serious, and a few days later, they were transferred to Wetzlar, the Luftwaffe distribution centre. The Gestapo informed them that they would be taking charge of them again, but the Luftwaffe did not allow this, since they were wearing army uniforms and had prisoner of war status. From there, they were handed over to the Wehrmacht, near to Limburg. The Germans never did find out Bowie's true identity. He and Corporal Manley were experts in sign language and invented a cover story which they coordinated using hand signals, and the trick worked. Finally, the 4 agents arrived at the Stalag 12A prisoner of war camp in Limburg. Unfortunately, though, 2 of them would not see the end of the war. On December 23, 1944, the United States 9th Air Force launched a day raid on railway marshalling yards near to the camp. The attack was continued at night by the RAF, but unfortunately some target-making incendiaries fell on the territory of the officers' camp, which was subsequently hit by several bombs. Both Major Wright and Lieutenant Voss were killed. Due to his alias, Lieutenant Colonel Bowie was in the regular enlisted men's camp with Corporal Manley and thus survived. When the camp was finally liberated, Bowie revealed his true identity and he was returned to England via Odessa. So, what happened after the Halifax with Marcel and his colleagues on board had dropped the spies? These missions were extremely dangerous and undertaken without fighter escort. Navigation above the darkened cities was very difficult, but the main hazard was the ubiquitous German night fighters. Upon reaching their drop zones, the planes had to fly low and sometimes had to overfly the area several times before they could release their load. Then the journey home took another anxious hour or more over occupied countries, peering into the darkness from which a night hunter waiting for his prey could emerge at any moment. That night, Me-110 G4 night fighter pilots from the Luftwaffe station in Szombathely, Hungary, were searching the skies. At 01:50 a.m., with the help of ground stations and his onboard radar, 25-year-old Hauptmann Leopold Fellerer, the squadron commander, came across JP-286 flying at 1,700 meters near to Kaposvár, Hungary. The bomber caught fire as a result of multiple hits and crashed close to Szent-gyorgy. Fellerer was an Austrian, born in Wiener Neustadt on the 7th of July 1919. In 1935, he volunteered for the Austrian Air Force, but was rejected, so he joined the army instead. After the Anschluss in 1938, he again attempted to join the Air Force, this time the Luftwaffe, but was again rejected, and so remained with the infantry. After several more attempts, he was finally accepted, and he began training as a bomber pilot in November 1938. During his time with the Luftwaffe, he achieved 41 kills, 39 of which were at night. In 1944, he was awarded the Knight's Cross. After the war, he joined the Austrian Air Force, became commander of the Langenlebahn Air Base in Tübingen on the Danube, and died in the crash of his favourite aircraft, a Cessna L-19, near Krems, Austria, on July 15, 1968. Eyewitness reports from people on the ground give us more detail about the crash of the Halifax. It was a beautiful moonlit night, almost cloudless. Suddenly we heard a deep rumbling. A large plane was approaching from the direction of Szent-gyorgy. It was flying very low, much lower than the American planes that had been bombing us during the day. Behind the plane was a small fighter. He kept diving at the large plane, sometimes above it, sometimes below, sometimes in front, sometimes behind. The pilot seemed very skillful. Then we noticed flames coming out of the large aircraft. We saw it descend steeply in the direction of Szent-gyorgy, and we heard it explode when it hit the ground. We immediately started running to the place. We saw that the plane first hit a row of poplar trees and then tore into the rye field behind it. It then slid along for about 100 meters all the way to the vineyard. I was one of the first to get there. The wreckage was still smoking. I saw the dead too. Not all of them were burned. They were immaculate, well-groomed gentlemen. One of them was lying further away from the wreckage. He probably flew out on impact. By the time we got there, a man was already at the wreck. He noticed that the airman lying farthest away had a gold wedding ring on his finger. He immediately pulled this off and tucked it in his pocket. Among the wreckage was plenty of food and clothing. My father picked up a large package of bound mail. It was a light khaki colour and had small holes from the impact, but was still usable. My parents cut it up to make clothes for us. The gendarme who arrived in the meantime looked at him with suspicion. Then other officials arrived and immediately seized the food and clothing. We did not feel sorry for the airmen because they were our enemies. They dug a pit in the cemetery, sprinkled straw at the bottom, put the dead on this, and then buried the pit. They didn't have a headstone, just a sign showing where the grave was. Sándor Csapó, shown here helping the investigators many years later, said, "I was 10 years old. We didn't hear the explosion. They only told us what happened the next day. In the morning, we went by bike to have a look. The plane came from Hetes, and there were those who saw it burning in the air. It flew into the poplar trees and slid on towards the vineyard between the trees where there was an acacia. The wreckage was scattered over a large area. I didn't see the dead. By the time we got there, the gendarmes were keeping a watchful eye, so it wasn't possible to look around much. I noticed something interesting on the ground about the size of a matchbox. I had no idea what it was. I picked it up and took it with me and put it away at home. I didn't look at it again until some months later. I saw some dust coming out of one end. I hit it several times and the dust started hissing. Then I hit it with a piece of iron and it exploded in my hand. 2 fingers of my left hand were torn off and my right thigh was full of splinters. My brother standing next to me had both his eyebrows and his face full of splinters. Besides me, there were a few others who were similarly unlucky. If we look carefully at the photograph, we can indeed see that Szent-gyorgy is missing the tops of a couple of fingers. Clearly he'd picked up a type of tracer bullet or maybe some armament that was due for delivery to the Yugoslav partisans. And, as he says, he wasn't the only one. There was a rumour circulating that the Allies were dropping toys packed with explosives in order to kill and maim children. Posters such as this one promoted the idea. However, all subsequent investigations have produced no proof of this. The father of the little girl used as the artist's model for the poster was a famous actor, unsolved, who was very angry with his wife for allowing her to be used in this way. The artist, Szent-gyorgy, was sentenced to 15 years imprisonment after the war for creating such propaganda posters, although he served only 7 years and died in 2007. SOE did have some 007-type weapons, but none were aimed at children. The local press report of the crash makes interesting reading, especially because of the inaccuracies. However, it does contain enough facts to create an air of credibility. Yesterday evening, the radio broadcast warned about intruder planes. When the emergency ended in the Kaposvár area, a 4-engine English bomber was flying at quite high altitude in the dark night sky. The English plane had separated from its group and was flying southwest as it tried to return to its home base in Italy. A Hungarian fighter plane, which was circling over Kaposvár, was notified about the lonely bomber and it dove down on it as a hawk, proving the famous Hungarian courage and fighting morality and commitment. The attack of the Hungarian fighter was successful, and the port outer engine of the bomber burst into flames. The bomber tried to escape, but when it became hopeless, it made a wide turn and as it got too close to the ground, tried to find a place for an emergency landing. A rye field waved to it invitingly between Hetes and Szent-gyorgy. The plane roared towards the rye field. Its port engine was on fire and the landing went wrong as it hit the ground hard, lifting off slightly and then gliding on. At the end of the rye field, it ran into an acacia row and a newly planted orchard, ripping the fence of the orchard and breaking trees. Then it was torn apart by several small detonations caused by its bomb load. The burnt area, piles of wreckage, and human body parts were approximately 100 meters long, marking the site of the tragedy. One of the landing wheels lies far from the wreck, and a burnt trail marks the path of a fuel tank which separated, then flew away. 9 unidentifiable crushed English pilots lie among the wreckage. Oxygen cylinders and hundreds of phosphorus bombs are scattered in a wide area. How much death, destruction and bitterness would have happened if those phosphorus cylinders had scattered over the field on that moonlit night, to those fields which promise a peace as they wait for harvesting. How many innocent Hungarian lives would have been lost if these bombs had not destroyed this huge plain, but instead the little houses of Hungarian villages? How much pain and misery would have marked the flight path of this behemoth bomber plane if that Hungarian fighter had not attacked it with great courage, like David, who mortally wounded Goliath. There lie 9 English pilots' bodies, scattered, charred, crushed, squashed, their limbs are crisscrossed, all of them in the same gruesome state. The smell of burnt flesh is in the air, and bluish smoke trails emerge from the wreckage towards the sunny sky. Next to the wreckage, a gendarme stands holding his rifle with the bayonet on it as the symbol of security. Many people came to see the wreckage. According to the pilot's documents, they belonged to the Middle East Air Force, and they dropped their deadly cargo over a desert hell when taking off from Egyptian airfields. Then, this year, the airmen moved to Italy and were ordered to deliver the same lethal message of the democratic world to us. Also, they found cash in the pilots' pockets, blue, pink and red-coloured banknotes. That was the blood money. Before they took off, they were paid in worthless notes, $400 per person. They took their killing and destroying role as a business for this price. But, thanks to destiny, the blood money which they got for killing innocent Hungarian people remained in the charred and crushed dead bodies' pockets. It is an unforgettable picture as we look at the scene of this terrible tragedy. No one can question these Englishmen, but their intentions are confirmed by the blood money and those hundreds of small phosphorus bombs which are scattered around, and the many high explosive bombs which ripped apart the plane. But there are better and more majestic thoughts. The faith and persistence which protect our homeland and families must overcome the devil of havoc paid for by the blood money. The Halifax was, of course, shot down by the Luftwaffe, not by Hungarians, and it certainly wasn't containing a bomb load, although, in fairness, the Hungarian population in the area was at that time subject to night bombing by the RAF and during the day by the Americans. The mistake of 9 airmen is possibly understandable prior to a full investigation, since body parts were spread all over the area. The blood money is an interesting claim. Based on the colours mentioned, they wouldn't have been dollars, but could well have been the crew's own cash, which they were carrying with them, especially in colourful Italian lira. For certain, there was ammunition on board which contained phosphorus, as Szent-gyorgy unfortunately found out. A local man, József Hegedűs, along with several others, buried the dead. When the British came for the bodies after the war, Hegedűs helped by showing where he'd buried them. In return, they offered that if he wanted to defect, they would help him get out of the country. In the end, this was not possible, since Soviet soldiers were everywhere. Hegedűs eventually emigrated to the USA a few years later, however. Apart from Marcel and the 4 SOE operatives, who else was on the Halifax that night? The pilot was squadron leader Sir Philip Bird from Middlesex. He was 24 and married with 2 daughters. He was highly experienced and had qualified prior to the war, starting on Spitfires and Hurricanes and retraining later on bombers. He was also a test pilot. He had already completed 1 tour of highly dangerous operations, but volunteered for a second. He had fought over Malta and at the Battle of El Alamein. When he took charge of 148 Squadron on the 25th of June 1944, he kept most of his original crew with him. The records show that they only had 24 hours of flying left to complete their current tour. Squadron leader Bird likely took the decision to stay with them for the last few missions. He was considered to be the best pilot in the squadron, especially at evasive tactics. The navigator was Flight Sergeant Peter Lake. He was 21 years old and came from York. Like Marcel, he enlisted at RAF Padgate in April 1941, so it's possible they might even have known each other then. The flight engineer was Pilot Officer Harold Pearson, aged 22. He started flying with Squadron Leader Bird's crew on the 10th of October 1943. Like Peter Lake and Marcel, he was also from Yorkshire. The bomb aimer and second navigator, Warrant Officer Donald Stewart, aged 21, came from Dundee, Canada, and he had been flying with this crew since the 27th of May 1944. Flight Sergeant Arthur Lee, the radio operator, was born in 1909. Originally from Nottingham, he spent his early life in Australia. He was married and joined the crew on the 11th of October 1943. The youngest member was Ronald Radford, the rear gunner. He enlisted in the RAF shortly after his 17th birthday and was also part of the original crew. It is believed he joined up after his hometown of Ramsgate in Kent became the first target of German bombing on the 28th of August 1940. He reached the rank of flight sergeant and was 20 when he died. Apart from Marcel, the other additional crew member drafted in especially for the mission was Flying Officer Kenneth Cran, aged 35. Also married, he'd flown many missions as a dispatcher, but none before with Squadron Leader Bird's crew. Little is known about him, although he probably appears somewhere in the group photographs of 148 Squadron. Before we leave JP 286 and Marcel, we should bring the story up to date. Due to the dedication and painstaking work of Gabor Nagy and his colleague Tamás Derner, it has been possible to collect and corroborate the visual and circumstantial evidence. It does seem that the aircraft was intact, although with an engine on fire when it hit the ground. This confirms the skill of Squadron Leader Bird, who clearly identified a space where he could land. What he couldn't have seen or known in the dark was the existence of that row of poplar trees that caused the Halifax to break up as it slid across the field towards the vineyard. And we have another reason to be grateful to Gabor and Tamás. Along with Hubert Wasman, a French businessman and amateur historian living in Hungary, it was possible to persuade the French government and the municipality of Mesochurkonya to erect a memorial to the crew of JP-286. This was unveiled on the 25th of May 2023 with some relatives of the aircrew present. Marcel is also remembered on the War Memorial in Lancel, as well as in the Scheumar Cemetery alongside his fellow flyers. We honour them.